Welcome to The Beat. This is the podcast where we talk about building equity, accountability, and trust with law enforcement. My name is Dr. Lori Hall, and today I'm joined by Chief Holloway from St. Pete Police Department. And we're going to be talking about policing protests and demonstrations. Thank you for joining me today, Chief.
Thank you for having me here, and thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and you?
I'm doing well. So, one of the biggest challenges with policing protest and demonstration is kind of maintaining that balance between ensuring the right of the public to peacefully assemble, but also making sure that we keep the community safe. Can you talk a little bit about how law enforcement go about approaching these protests and demonstrations and preparing for them?
Sure. So the hardest part is we say preparing for the worst, hoping for the best.
Right.
Because really, if you look at it, 95% of the people just want to get their message out. They just want to peacefully demonstrate and let everybody know what the issues are and how they want government or wherever they want them to respond. But you're always going to have that 5%ers that want to come in there and cause a disturbance. They're not really for the group that's trying to get their message out. They're trying to get their message out. So the hardest part is trying to figure out how you're going to do that, respect for what they're doing, but also make sure the demonstrators are respecting the other people that are around them.
Right.
So that's where that fine line comes into play.
Yeah, so people have the right to assemble, right?
Correct.
But it doesn't mean that people can just go out and assemble. They generally have to go about and get I lost the word. What's the word?
Permit?
Yes. They have to get a permit, right?
Yes.
So when they apply for these permits, are you all notified?
We are involved in it, and what we need to do is what time of the day is going to be. Are they going to be obstructing traffic? Can we get the message out to the other people that are not demonstrating and say, hey, you don't want to go down street A because there's going to be a protest there at that time of afternoon, and get it out to the media. So once we get all the information out, once we get the information back, we're not going to deny the permit. We just want to know. So, and who's going to be there? What type of signs are going to be there? Can you carry these type of signs? And really just educate the protesters. You can't carry a blowhorn, bullhorn, whatever you want to call it, out. So that's what we want to do.
So y'all actually get to make a decision on whether or not this is kind of approved or not. And there are factors that kind of go into that. Generally, you try to approve them, but if there's some, mitigating thing that might prevent that from happening that day. So you are all the law enforcement agency is the one that approves these permits.
Yeah, well, we're not just the only, we're just
Okay.
part of the puzzle, and we just really look out for safety.
Right.
How's this going to affect not only safety of the protester, but the safety of the community? And once we can get those two things together, then we move forward with it. Believe it or not, most of the protesters or the organizers of it, they really do reach out to us. They talk to us and say, okay, this is what we want to do. They're not asking us about, hey, how we want to get our message out. So a lot of them are saying, how can we do this peacefully so that we don't get hurt and we don't cause a problem?
Right. Okay. So whenever you do get the permits and they get approved and then the event is going to occur, do you all automatically have like a policy where law enforcement are just going to be there?
Yes. So it's according to the crowd size. And then we also we'll ask the demonstrators, and we'll also look anything else. Is there a counter protest that's going to happen? Is there going to be someone that's going to try to disrupt their message? So then we'll have my sergeant's charge of special events. He will look at it and say, okay, this is what we need to do. And then we'll have a meeting with command staff and say, okay, this is how we're going to staff this. This is what we've seen around the nation. So we just want to be prepared for it. Like, prepare for the worst.
Okay. Right. So pretty much you have law enforcement respond and they're there for most all of the protests that occur.
Correct.
And these are like preventive measures to ensure the safety of the protesters, but also anybody else that might show up or bystanders and all of that, just to maintain kind of crowd control.
Yeah, and like say sometimes a group says we're going to stand at the street corner of A and B, and we're going to hold out signs. We will probably have an officer there. He or she may be parked across just in the area, just in case someone tries to disrupt what they're trying to do.
Right.
And then once it's over with, then we just go back to work. Sometimes the sergeant or an officer say it's very peaceful. Their messages, they're just standing there on the street corner. There's no other county protesters. We'll check on it every 15 minutes.
Okay. So is there any like protests, permits that you've kind of have this idea like, yes, this is going to become like a heated kind of thing. There's going to be counter protesters. There's going to be a lot of tension in the community. Are you aware of those, or are you don't know?
You're aware of some of them. I have to go date back way when I first started. I remember the Klan came into
Mm,
Pinellas County, and then okay, so they're going to be counter demonstrators, but they still have a right to get their message out. So,
right.
how do you protect what they're doing? How do you
Mm,
protect the counter protesters? And how do you hate to say find that sweet spot? I hate to say you have
mhm,
to draw a line and saying you stay over here and you stay over there. So you
mm,
have those type of groups. Then you have maybe the far right, the far left. They both want to protest about something. They both want to get their message out. So
mhm,
how do we go about making sure that both parties have a right to speak, but
right.
they don't engage in trying to cause a disturbance or hurt each other?
And I think that that's difficult for the public when, for example, the Klan, files for a permit to protest and it's approved, and law enforcement are there doing the same thing that they would do in the event of it was any other group. The public typically, kind of is confused, right? They would
Right,
think, well, we don't want to hear from those people. Right. So
right,
why are they getting approved? And then why are law enforcement there? 'Cause they view it as, like, support, so to speak, right? And so it gets difficult because, as you're saying, we all have the right to peacefully assemble. It's not about the message, it's just about the right and ensuring and protecting that right for all people, right?
right. And you bring up a great point because a lot of people then turn against law enforcement because they look at us that we are protecting them. Yes, we are. They have a
Mhm.
right, but then
Right,
now we're part of that group, and like, how, how do you assume that? It's just
right.
like they did everything they're supposed to do. They have a right.
Yeah.
Our job is to make sure they don't get hurt and you
Mhm.
don't get hurt. That everybody has a right to speak.
Right. You're exactly right. It's difficult for the public to kind of see, right, that law enforcement are there, they're doing a job, and it's not about ideology or affiliation. It's we're here to protect people, period, right?
Right.
And so that brings up kind of a challenge too, because then you have other people that kind of see that and then they get angry. And so sometimes protests can become, violent.
Correct.
So, say for example, you have a protest that you're not necessarily anticipating, like counter protesters or anything like that, and then this begins to happen. What is the response for law enforcement?
Then once they start to damage property or cause some type of bodily harm, then that's when we're going to step in. That's when we're going to take law enforcement action. And then we have a team prepared for that. There may, like you see on TV sometimes, you see officers standing there with shields, and that's really to protect that person, protect the officers, because we don't want to see our law enforcement officers get hurt.
Mhm,
The only time I would say we go on offense is when there is some property being destroyed or someone's getting hurt.
mm,
9 times out of 10, we're just going to stand there and let you voice your right or your opinion. And then if we have to go on the offense, we will go on the offense. And that's when you will see
mhm.
us starting to move forward in a straight line and make the crowd to disperse. But
Yeah.
as long as there, again, no one's damaging any property, no one's getting hurt, we're just going to stand there and we're going to just listen, let you voice your opinion. Uh, the governor did pass law. There's a law now about blocking traffic. So if you're causing traffic interference, we'll tell you, hey, you need to move on to the side of the street. I
Mm,
can say here in St. Pete, we've worked a lot with our organizers, and they will move to the sidewalk. You'll see a lot of people walking up and down the street on sidewalk, and there's nothing wrong with that. The
yeah.
other people, they don't like it. You're trying to have an afternoon with your family, and you see these people in your way, or these protesters in your way. So, okay, you're gonna have to walk around.
Yeah. So, where is that line between when these events become or go from, say, demonstrations to protests? From a law enforcement perspective, do you have a distinction?
We don't have a string because everything is a demonstration, or when you're demonstrating, you're protesting against something.
Mm,
So there is no. I'm not going to say no that you. Because we want to protest. Okay, and we're going to demonstrate again. So to me, I look at it. It's the same. It's the same
right.
act. The
Okay.
only time, like I said, we're going to get involved again if there's some type of damage to property or someone's life is getting hurt.
So, another word that people tend to use is riots. Is there a distinction within law enforcement when y'all say this has now moved beyond a peaceful protest demonstration to a riot?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and that's when we see property damage or someone getting hurt or someone trying to hurt a law enforcement officer. To then, now it's a disorderly crowd. It's not an orderly crowd, it's a disorderly crowd. So
Mhm.
our job is then to go in and to break that up. Before
Mhm.
again, before this business owner's property is destroyed or before some innocent person there or a protesters there or a demonstrator, whatever we're gonna call it, that he or she's there, protesting peacefully, but this other person decides to start throwing rocks or throw a Molotov cocktail or something like that, that's when we're gonna get involved.
Right. So when it moves from peaceful to now we're breaking the law, it changes terminology to now it's a riot, and that's not protected.
That is not protected.
Right. And so if you think back during like all of the protests, demonstrations, riots during the time of like George Floyd, um, those kind of moved into riots. They went from peaceful to now they're violent. They were burning cars and breaking business windows and all of those things. And law enforcement responded with, as you said, like the shields and the moving forward in the lines. And then those altercations kind of grew in tension. And there were a lot of controversies and a lot of discussions among the public about inappropriate action by law enforcement, right? Either it was overly aggressive or, they were violent. What from a law enforcement perspective, can you kind of give us your thoughts as you remember like seeing all of that and playing out?
Sure, and I think people, didn't realize they were only seeing one part of what actually happened. They didn't see what led up to the officers making the arrest, the violent part of it or the disorderly part of it. While they were just standing there, and you saw some videos where sometimes there was a stare off where the person would stand right in front of a police officer and they would look them in the eye and nothing would happen. But then
Mhm.
that one person, he or she would decide to go and hit the officer, hit the shield. Sometimes we won't even take action on that. We'll just say, okay, as long as you're not trying to hurt us, we
Mhm.
understand. But you get to that point where you cross over that line. Crossing over that line is actually trying to physically hurt that officer, or trying to cause some type of property damage. And then we're going to use force to meet the force that's being given to us. And I think that's what we saw a lot in the media, that we stopped showing the peaceful protests and
Mhm.
we start showing the people, the 2 percenters, because that's what was selling.
It sells, yeah.
That's people want to see that because
Yeah.
here in our city there was a lot of protesting going on. I can't remember, it was over 100 and some odd days,
Yeah.
7 days a week, and the people just march and get their point across and they go home.
Mhm.
That wasn't the story.
Right.
But the first time someone jumped on someone's car or did something, that's the story.
Yeah.
So that group got blamed for two people action.
Right.
So the
Yeah.
message is lost, then our message is lost, and then
Mhm.
now it's the officer's out of control.
Yeah. And a lot of people in the public kind of take issue with the riot gear that law enforcement wears. So we're talking the shields, as you mentioned, and the helmets that they might wear, and then they see them carrying the batons and things like that. Um, but this is protective gear that law
Correct.
enforcement are using because it's now escalated. And again, as you mentioned, you don't see a distinction between protests and demonstrations, but these all fall into that same kind of peaceful category. And then once it moves to, breaking the law, it's a riot now. And that's when you kind of show up in this gear, so to speak, right? But the public isn't really making that distinction. Okay, now this is escalated, and now law enforcement needs to protect themselves. Because as you mentioned, you're not showing up in riot gear for a protest,
Correct.
right? You've got an officer that might be there depending on the size. There might be more officers, but for the most part, they're kind of in the background. They're not really a part of this. They're just making sure that, everybody's safe and nothing goes awry, right? But then you have a team that comes in. Can you talk about a little bit about um, why you employ the use of riot gear?
Sure. So at any demonstration or protest, I would call it, my term now, a soft approach. You'll see an officer that he or she just in a uniform, they're just standing there and they're just listening to people. When we feel like it's starting to escalate, where again, we feel like we see objects may be thrown at us, or the crowd is starting to get agitated, then we're going to move that soft team and we're going to put up a defensive team, because I don't want to see the police officers get hurt. You don't want to see the police officers get hurt. So when they're coming up there, it's not riot gear, it's protective gear. They're trying to protect themselves from getting hurt, because there is going to be that one or two people in the crowd that are going to throw something at that police officer, and he or she could get hurt. Whereas when that shield is up there, then they can block if somebody's throwing a water bottle or whatever. A lot of people think, oh, it's just a water bottle. Just let me hit you with a water bottle full of water.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
and people say things like, well, you men and women should be prepared. There's nobody prepared to get hit by a water
Right.
bottle. I
Right.
mean, I've gone to sporting events and people get mad when someone throws a bottle. Uh,
Yeah.
so, so I think, and I'm glad you're bringing it up that way. I think people should understand that that's just a defensive posture, that something caused us to go to that next level.
Mhm.
Let's go from the protective gear to then where we have to start when we go on the defense, when we have to deploy smoke or something to move the crowd out.
Mhm.
That's because we're meeting what the crowd has done.
Right.
It's time for us to disperse that crowd. So we look at it as, what is the safest way we can disperse the crowd? And I think
Mhm.
that's where people get it confused. It's not how do we arrest people? It's what's the safest way? Because what we normally see are the people that are there peacefully protesting, they
Mhm.
go away because they don't want a part of that.
Right.
It's the other group that we're trying to get away.
Yeah, so you're talking about the hijackers,
Yes.
right? The people that come in with the intent of using violence and force in some capacity, and like you said, the protesters say, "I want none of this," and I'm leaving. And some counter protesters do the same, but then you have those few that kind of stay behind. And we've seen a lot of videos in the media, and I know that there's distortions and they leave out details, but for a few examples, one, there was a video that surfaced where a law enforcement officer kind of pulled the face mask off of an individual and then pepper sprayed them. And then there was other videos where law enforcement maybe pushed or shoved individuals to the ground. Can you talk about, like as in your role, in your position, if that had been something that you had witnessed in St. Pete during protest activity, what would be your thoughts or your response if your officers had done something like that?
Well, what I would have to look, because I'm not there, I'm not living. I always say in that moment, if that officer, and I haven't seen that video, maybe that officer pulled that mask down because that person was being very aggressive toward him and he or she was trying to get the advantage, so it's safe. So the only way I can do that is to take that piece of equipment that they have on and use the piece of equipment that I know is going to work. Instead of me spraying the whole crowd, I just want to spray you because you're the agitator and you're the one that I want to take to jail. So I would say, because that officer's living in that moment, I would say, okay, then he or she had to do what they felt was safe. Someone gave
Mhm.
them the order also. Also, just don't do that on their own. They've been
Mhm.
told like how they're going to escalate the use of force. So, and then after it happened, then we would review it. Did we do the right thing? And then how can we do it better?
Mhm.
The same thing is if some officer is pushing someone down to the ground, what caused us to get to that point?
Mhm.
Uh, I can tell you if it's a big demonstration, it's going to come from me or one from the assistant chief. So you're going to have somebody, command staff, that's there that's going to be giving those orders. Here in St. Pete, there's no officer that's going to take that on his own. I always use the thing of Roadhouse. If you remember that movie, be nice
Mm.
until I tell you not to be nice.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's it.
Right. So there's a lot of factors that go into that.
Yes.
And y from your position, you wouldn't have officers out there just acting without some type of quote unquote order, right?
Correct.
From, higher ups that are surveying the situation and assessing the level of tension and the level of aggression and violence that's being used. Another tactic that law enforcement used, like you mentioned, was deploying the smoke bombs and things like that to disperse crowds. What is the reasoning, right, that you would use those things?
So it's just like giving people almost like a warning. We're deploying smoke. Again, the peaceful protesters, they're going to leave because they know, you know what, the police has had enough of those people that are causing the disturbance, and they're going to take some type of action. So it's time for me to leave because it's not peaceful anymore.
Right.
There's someone that's hijacking our message. So let's
Mhm.
come back at another time and meet the police department. So again, that is either going to be by the commander or myself who's on the scene to watch and get a feel for it. Because just like you have the protesters, you need somebody that's in charge of the organization, someone that says, okay, we're at a point that we've got to stop this.
Right. So when we talk about, law enforcement present at these events, and maybe you begin to kind of see that they're escalating, what are some of the tactics that you generally have officers employ to de-escalate these before it gets to the place where maybe you have to use pepper spray, or you have to use smoke, or you have to put on riot gear? What are some of the things that you're doing to de-escalate the tension?
So if we can find out who the organizer of the protest or demonstration is, we'll try to make contact with that person and say, okay, you're gonna again, like it's almost like pulling a permit. You're in charge of it, Dr. Hall. What are you gonna do? How many people? When it starts to get out of control, can I contact you so you can talk to the demonstrators and bring them back? And then we'll give warnings over. We have this set speech that you need to disperse within the next 10 minutes, or you're subject to the arrest. You need to disperse within the next 8 minutes. So it's almost like a countdown.
Mm,
So the peaceful demonstrators, they know what's coming, and they know, you know what? Okay, it's time to go.
right.
You
Yeah.
know, we have lost the message. We have lost control over the crowd. Let me come back because you said something earlier, and you're right. And I tell people all the time, the George Floyd message got lost
Mhm.
because people hijacked the message.
Yeah.
Because then after a while, all we saw was disorderly conduct,
Right. Yeah.
and there were some people out there were trying to get the message across that what happened shouldn't have happened.
Right. And yeah, that's, I think, one of the biggest problems with protesting and demonstrating is the hijacking, right? There are some individuals that come in and they take over, and then the message is lost and it becomes about this riot and the violence that's occurring, and then the message is muted, and then equally everyone else in the public through the lens of the media is saying, "Oh, well, they were violent people."
Right.
Right? So they're labeling the protesters and the demonstrators as violent, and then the message dies, right? And it's really because of these hijackers, these individuals that come in and take advantage of the situation that is building, and then they spin it and they turn it and it becomes this violent thing. So when we talk about policing protests and demonstrations, from a law enforcement perspective, what would you say is probably your greatest challenge?
Our greatest challenge is going back to what we said, we have to be careful of someone trying to hijack the protest or the demonstration
Mm,
because they're there also for their video because
mhm,
they want to catch us doing something. We may be doing it right, but they're not going to show you what led up to us using
mm,
going on the offense.
right,
They're only going to show you that defense part of it. So
mhm,
the hardest part is, first of all, picking the right officers to be on the emergency response team. You're going to
mhm,
need someone that's very cool headed, that understands, hey, you're going to hear a lot, but you just need to sit there and take it and let people voice their opinion.
right,
And then the next thing is just getting ready for it. And as a chief, I tell everybody, does that make me nervous? It does, because I don't know what's going to happen because they can be very peaceful and then
mm,
all of a sudden it goes sideways.
right,
And then how do you take that back under control?
yeah,
So it's like I understand that they're going to protest against X, and that's fine. You have that right. But when you lose control of the crowd, the person that's in charge of the protest or the demonstration, then I have to take some type of action, or we have to take some type of action.
mhm,
Because again, our biggest job, and I think people forget it, is our job is to protect people and property.
right, mhm. So when we think about a protest event that becomes violent and property's damaged and people are hurt, who's responsible for that?
And I'm not going to blame it on the person that organized the demonstration because that wasn't their intent. We should put where blame was due, the people that are causing the destruction.
Right,
Those are Don't label that group, oh, that group is violent, that group. It wasn't that group. It
right,
wasn't, it was the people in that group. Well, and just like you said, everybody says, well, it is that group. No,
right,
unless you're going to tell me the organizer threw the first rock, the
right,
organizer threw the first brick, then it's on the organization because that person is in charge of it, so he or she should own it.
Right.
But if I'm in charge of it and my people are doing the right thing, then it's not my responsibility. So don't label me with that group.
Right. So in the event that there is property damage or, people injured, i- is, once this crowd begins to disperse, how do law enforcement go about holding those individuals accountable that did those things?
Well, we try to make sure we can videotape them, catch up their picture or something like that. Maybe we can't get to them, but then later on we can arrest them. Or if we can get to that person, then we're going to try to arrest that person right then and there because he or she should be held accountable for damaging someone's property or trying to hurt someone. Again, keyword is not peaceful anymore. You're
Right.
causing destruction.
Mhm.
And that's one thing we shouldn't tolerate. That's our
Mhm.
job. That's our job as law enforcement, is to
Mhm.
quote unquote keep the peace.
Right. So there was a few videos that I have seen during different protest events that became violent, where individuals were damaging police vehicles, or there were some instances where they got into police vehicles and drove them around. Um, how, from a chief's perspective, what are the things that could have been done to prevent that from happening in terms of getting in a vehicle and taking it? And then how do you respond when vehicles are damaged?
Well, from police perspective, is first of all, how did they get in those cars? Did the officers leave the keys in the car? Did we cause that part of it?
Mhm.
So, and then I don't know. Maybe the officers had to respond very quickly. They got out of the car and they forgot. Okay, so that's a training issue. So that shouldn't happen. And if it does happen, then the next time there's going to be a next time. So how do you make sure that when you respond to a protest that you secure your car? The people that are taking the cars and destroying the cars, then they should be held accountable for that. They should have to pay for that monetarily, or they should have to do time in jail.
Mhm. Okay. So you do everything that you can to prevent those things from happening, and then holding those people accountable so that they can pay for the damages.
Correct.
Okay. So in thinking about um, protests and demonstrations, what is, I guess, maybe the greatest lesson that you've learned in your role as chief across the years on approaching protests and demonstrations?
To meet with the organizer or to go out, and we did it here, go out and talk to the people. They're there. They want someone to listen. It doesn't hurt me to listen,
Mhm.
but let them know that you're there. If everybody's screaming at me, I can't hear everybody, or we can't hear everyone.
Right.
The organizer should have a message, and they'll probably say it over and over again. And then as they're saying that message, what do I have in my power that I can control that, you know what, maybe we need to look at something. As
Right.
soon as we said, no, we're not going to do that, then we just close it off.
Right.
Maybe it's something that's very simple that we can work on together. Meet
Right.
somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Okay. So my last question is, what is one thing or something that you wish the public knew with regard to policing protests and demonstrations?
That we may feel the same way they feel about a subject, but our job again is to protect and serve the community as a whole. And let me give you a good example because it shocked me and we thought about it during the George Floyd protest. There was a lot of conversation. And I still smile about it today. This young lady, she was there and she was really giving it to me. And then she finally says, "You don't know what it's like to be black." And I had to stop because and I had to look down and go, she doesn't see me as an African American.
Right.
She sees me in this blue uniform, and I mean, even it was kind of funny because everybody in the crowd looked around, and she was going at. So it's like, okay, let's take a step back
Yeah.
and let's hear each other. So
Mm.
I think, and you saw that around the nation. If you start looking, you saw police chiefs and police sheriffs and politicians going out and starting to listen to people
Mm.
because that's what the demonstration and protests were about. Please listen to me. Just
Mhm.
hear my message. And then once you hear my message, just don't shake your head and say, I hear you. Let me know, It can't be done. But then explain it to me why it can't be done. Just don't say no just to say no. Hey,
Right.
this doesn't work because I always tell people, you want to change the law, then vote.
Mm,
Get someone to change it.
yeah. I think you bring up a really good point, though, for the flip side, right? So you were basically saying that the public was basically begging, asking for law enforcement to listen to them in those moments. But I think that the public also needs to hear from law enforcement,
Correct.
and we don't necessarily allow space for that. We want responses from law enforcement. Why did you do this? Why did this happen? Right? But we don't want to hear law enforcement's perspective or side with regard to whatever is happening, whatever's going on. And I think that that's just as important. So to hear each other, to hear from each other, I think is an extremely important part of the puzzle so that we can ensure that our communities are safe and that people are heard, people are respected, but we also have to hear from all the voices that are involved.
And that's what you do by doing this and everything you do with your students. Let both sides listen, because sometimes you just hear one side of the story,
Right.
and not just hearing, but listening to what they say, because everybody sees it from different lenses. But then let's talk about it, because
Right.
let me, like you're asking today, why do we use that? Why do
Yeah.
we use those shields? Well, they're using
Yeah.
those shields because they're gonna go into the crowd. No, they're using the shield to protect themselves. It's one of those things is, let us explain every piece of equipment that we have and why we use it. All of our equipment is 9 times out of 10 is defensive.
Mm-hmm.
There's very rarely we have an offensive piece of equipment. And when we use offensive piece of equipment, we're doing it because we're trying to protect someone.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, thank you for joining me today. It was very informative and I enjoyed it. You're watching The Beat. This is the podcast where we talk about building equity, accountability, and trust with law enforcement.